I remember being at one of those day-long workshops for clergy about 100 years ago in Montreal, when it was reported that families in that era, and that would have been the early 90s, were eating less than 3 meals together in any given week. And I don't think I was married at the time, and I thought to myself, oh, that can't be. And then I had a family of my own, and then I had teenagers who were going one direction for track and another direction for violin, and well, I just became part of the statistics. And it's not as though we were dining at McDonald's. I mean, there was always a meal that was made, but supper is bigger than the food that you put in your mouth. Supper is what happens when you sit around the table. It's around the table where families are fed. It's around the table where communities are fed. And studies show that children belonging to families that gather regularly for a meal around the table are children that are more resilient in the midst of the challenges that life will throw at them. Well, we're not surprised to hear that, are we? And then there's the back end of our lives. On my way through Chateauguay a few years back, I served the church there for a number of years. I connected with a couple of older women, friends from the former congregation. Both were in their 80s. One widowed, the other with a husband in long-term care, and we met at the local Tim Hortons. And we weren't there for an hour when another member of the congregation showed up, also a widow. I just didn't feel like making a meal just for myself, she said. And all three of them agreed that the art of preparing supper had no joy, and there was no lonelier exercise than sitting down to eat it by themselves. As a woman who didn't marry until her early 30s, I can tell you about invitations to dinner that saved my life. Because as rich and full as it was, the table was a constant reminder of my solitary existence. So let me make an observation about the times in our sacred story when food is salvation. Of course, we have the primary story of the Jewish people, the Israelites in the desert, who are fed manna or bread daily. And then we have the primary prophet of the Old Testament, saved by a widow who thought that she only had enough ingredients to make a last meal for herself and her son, and surprise, surprise, the story tells us that when she invites him into her circle, there is enough for all of them. And of course, Jesus taking loaves and fishes and feeding a hungry crowd, providing instructions at a final meal. I think you can see a theme here. The God of Israel offered a simple invitation. The God of Israel put on the apron and said, "Be my guest. And if you'll be my guest, if you'll join me at this table, then you need to be prepared to practice that hospitality to everyone you meet. Because my hospitality offers a place at the table for everyone." So the passage is Zacchaeus. Let me remind you of that story. Zacchaeus is a tax collector for the empire. He is Jewish, but he is one of those people who works for the Romans. So the Romans demanded a certain amount of money from their constituents, and well, with the right manipulation, a tax collector, could make quite a good living. The community would have known about his extortion. Small communities, and they were all small, knew what was going on. And so Zacchaeus would have been a man without a tribe, which means he would have been a man without a table. He would not have been accepted by the Jewish community because of his collaboration with the Romans, nor would he have been accepted by the Gentiles. He was Jewish. And like many others who found themselves seeking out the presence of Jesus, regardless of who they were or to whom they belonged, Zacchaeus climbed a tree because he was simply too short to catch a glimpse of this wandering rabbi any other way. And Jesus, always perceptive, possibly curious, calls out to him and suggests that they have a meal together. And then the grumbling began. Because table fellowship in the ancient world was a huge symbol of belonging both to a tribe and to God. The food laws, the laws around kosher food, were meant to keep you clean. You didn't eat with people who were not like you because they were going to eat food that wasn't clean, and that would make you unclean. And for many in that culture, being clean was part of keeping the Jewish holiness code. You might have noticed the line in the piece from Fiddler on the Roof, and keep us from the stranger's ways. Very tribal table. We've belonged to it too. So Zacchaeus would have been considered unclean, 1, because of his profession, 2, because of his employers, and 3, because of his dishonesty. And you just don't eat with people like that. But Jesus wasn't driven by a vision of the holiness code. Jesus was driven by a vision of table fellowship. And the invitation to the table gave Zacchaeus a change of heart. He decided to pay back all those he had cheated and to share his wealth with the poor. And what does Jesus say once Zacchaeus makes that declaration to change his own practices? He says, "Today is salvation day in this home. Here he is, Zacchaeus, a son of Abraham." And so Jesus provides a bridge to restore Zacchaeus to his tribe, to his community, to the table. And one more thing happens at the same time. He is restored to his own humanity. He is moved to act with generosity and fairness. And that is what is at the heart of table fellowship. When we are restored to one another, we become more human. When we share a table with someone, we have to come to terms with how we will live with one another. When we share a table with someone, we recognize our common need to be fed not just in body, but in soul. Jesus spent his ministry telling people stories or parables that would help them see their lives differently, on the one hand. And then he lived out a parable by inviting them to break bread with him. In many ways, every meal that he shared with the maligned Pharisee or the woman with reputation or the tax collector or even the family friend was just another parable, just another sign of the mystery that he was inviting people to acknowledge. And the parable that he acted out, every time he sat at the table, was simple. Living in community, he suggested, can be this simple, particularly in a community where there was scarcity. For that moment, in the meal, we all have enough for the journey. We have food, we have drink, we have friendship for today. So I heard from a colleague of mine the other day, it doesn't matter what the context was for the conversation, but he said, the only time, he said, I dress in my clerical robes and gown, etc., is when we're celebrating the Lord's Supper. And I responded to him. I said, that's really interesting, Stephen. Can you tell me why? And what he said was, he said, you know, Lynn, he said, there's something about that symbol of gathering around a table, breaking bread together, being community. He said, if the entire world were to act out of that story, that parable, the world would be a different place. He said, I think it's really, really important, so I wear special robes. At the heart of the biblical witness is an affirmation that every meal is sacramental. Every meal mediates mystery. Every meal is sacred practice. Every meal is a powerful invitation to recognize the vision of God for this planet. Every meal is an invitation to create a healthy community. Every meal is a reminder of the basics. Every meal is a reminder of God's generosity. Every meal is an invitation to share. For everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, food, friends, fellowship for this day.